this is what we're going to look at here today. What is net zero? What does it look like in real life? Is clean energy actually clean? A lot of the time you'll hear that we're trying to do a just transition, so I'll ask, is it actually just? Is it clean? Then I'll look at the cost, because we have a paper coming out soon. It's in final layout now that will look at how much actually is net zero going to cost, so you'll get a little bit of a preview of what are those costs and what is it that's going to happen to your utility bills from consumers or DTE. We'll look at the two scenarios that we modeled and then wrap up with trying to balance environment and economics. So what is net zero? What drives it in the state of Michigan? The big thing that's driving it, first off, is Governor Whitmer's My Healthy Climate Plan. That plan, in a nutshell, I mean, it does a bunch of things, but the punchline of that report is that it commits the state to 100% economy-wide carbon neutrality by the year 2050. Now, in December 2023, the legislature passed several different laws, but the primary one that impacts electricity generation and provision across the state is Public Act 235. That law requires the state to get 60% of its electricity from so-called renewable sources by 2035. Now, there are some allowances for things like hydro and landfill gas, that kind of thing, but the reality is this means basically 57 to 59% wind and solar is where we're supposed to get our electricity from. And then the next part of that bill is it does allow 100% clean energy by the year 2040. Clean can include new nuclear plants, which is okay, good for them, they got that one right. But it also will allow natural gas if natural gas has 90% carbon capture on it. So the problem with that is nowhere on the planet has carbon capture actually achieved a 90% capture rate. So what that means for the state is unless you can achieve that, you don't get to use natural gas by the year 2040. So one of our cleanest, most reliable energy sources could go the way of the dodo unless that law is changed. So how does it work in real life if we're going to achieve these changes to our grid? We're going to transition to 60% wind and solar. We're going to transition to 100% clean. If you talk to the people that actually manage the grid, whose job it is to ensure that our grid runs reliably and affordably, then they come up with things like this. So the first quote is from a guy named Todd Ramey. He's one of the senior vice presidents at an organization called the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO for short. Todd's job and MISO's job is to make sure that the Midwestern grid runs affordably and reliably, okay? Todd was testifying before Federal House Energy Committee, and he said the following during his testimony, that controllable dispatchable resources, which means nuclear and fossil fuels, are being retired and replaced primarily with weather-dependent, non-dispatchable, and variable generation. That means wind and solar. So we're doing that to achieve carbon reduction goals, but weather-dependent generators are increasing reliability risks. So he said this before the House Energy Committee in Washington, D.C. Heads up, guys, there's problems coming down the road, okay? MISO wasn't finished because Todd's boss said the same thing. So John Baer, who's the CEO of MISO, said this in a publication that MISO published last February and said bluntly, the transition that's underway to get to a decarbonized end state is posing material adverse challenges to electric reliability. So we quoted John Baer in this report that my colleague Joshua Antonini and I wrote. We also quoted other people from FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, from NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. They said the same thing. There's recently been other hearings before House Energy Committees that said others from ERCOT, which is Texas, PJM, which is basically Ohio and out to the east coast. The Southern Power Pool also testified. The California ISO also testified. They all said the same thing. The rushed transition to wind and solar, where we're shutting down reliable fossil fuels and nuclear plants and trying to replace it with wind and solar, is doing that exact thing, posing material adverse challenges to electric reliability. Put in English, that means blackouts. Electricity shortages and blackouts. In the real world, that's what's happening. So if you watch, January 24, there was a whole bunch of problems related to a polar vortex. So all across the nation, we had rolling blackouts in Oahu because their solar and wind couldn't keep up with demand. We had ERCOT, which again is Texas. They hadn't learned from February 2021, where they had the big blackout from Winter Storm Uri. They're still publishing warnings to their people. You need to stop using electricity because we don't have enough supply. There was kind of an amusing post from Scott Moe, who's the premier of Saskatchewan, the Canadian province. He posted on Twitter or X and said, Saskatchewan, which is using coal and natural gas to provide reliable energy, was exporting electricity to the province of Alberta, because Alberta is in the midst of shutting down their coal plants, shutting down their nuclear plants, and building wind and solar. Alberta, of all places. For those who are not familiar, Alberta is basically Canada's version of Texas. That's where the natural gas is produced. That's where the coal is produced. So they're still going through energy shortages and needing to import electricity from Saskatchewan to keep the lights on. And at that time, just FYI, it was minus 45. So when you have blackouts at minus 45, I used to go outside and work as a forester in northern British Columbia. I would go outside for like 8 to 10 hours at minus 45. I guarantee you it's cold. If you're not prepared for that, you can die. Straightforward and simple. It's as scary as you can imagine. At minus 45, if you're shutting off people's electricity, you are threatening their lives. So that's what we're dealing with. So that was January 2024. This was this year. Anybody remember Spain in April, like at the end of April, what happened there? The entire Iberian Peninsula blacked out. Why? Because they were getting 72% of their electricity from wind and solar. So they did not have the ability to balance out the frequencies that you need. In Europe, it's 50 hertz. In North America, it's 60 hertz. But they didn't have what's called mechanical inertia. So when you have big coal plants and that sort of thing, you have large pieces of metal spinning at a certain rate. If they happen to have a fluctuation, inertia keeps the frequencies the same. You get that with coal, with nuclear, with natural gas, with hydro, that sort of thing. You do not get it with wind and solar. So when they started having frequency problems in their grid, France, which was using nuclear, said, whoa, you guys are too unstable, we're shutting you off. So they shut off. France has a lot of nuclear. They're the reliable ones, okay? Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, went dark. So that was April 29th this year. A few days later, May 25th, the entire city of New Orleans went black. Over 100,000 people lost their power for several hours. MISO, again, they run part of that grid. It goes from Canada down to Louisiana. That grid, the MISO grid, they published a note that said it was a deliberate load shedding event. So load shedding means we don't have enough generation capacity, you people don't get electricity. They did that deliberately because they didn't have sufficient capacity to supply the city of New Orleans, which needed air conditioning and that sort of thing. If you've ever been in New Orleans in the summer, it's a little warm there. Okay, so They didn't have it, so the city gets shut down. Sorry, too bad. That's what's going on right now. Now, most of you would think that's a problem, right? We shouldn't be doing that. Nope. It's not a problem. It's a feature of net zero. And so I give you quotes from a guy named David McDermott Hughes, who is a professor at Rutgers, anthropology prof, who wrote an article for Boston Review a few years ago and said, to save the climate, North Americans need to give up their demand for constant electricity. So get that, think about that for a second. In his article, he said we should use the Zimbabwean grid and post-Hurricane Maria Puerto Rico's grid as a template or model for what we might call pauseful electricity. Pauseful electricity is the new model from some of these, the academics, the big thinkers who are saying we need to stop climate change. Pauseful electricity will help save lives. So he's not alone. We have other groups like the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy saying, well, you know how businesses for years have run on a 24/7, like they expect to have reliable energy? You expect that, right? Okay, well, if you are a business and you want to run 3 8-hour shifts, well, that's not going to happen because we need to adapt. We're going to have to require these businesses to adapt to accommodate the effects of weather conditions. So if you think back in North America's past, what did our great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents do? They sat in their cabins, in their homes, and they prayed, Lord, please send the right weather so that we can get the crops in this year, right? Please let it dry in July, August so that the crops don't rot on the ground after we cut them down, right? That's what they used to pray. Now we're praying, Lord, please send the right weather so I can keep my air conditioner running. It's a feature of net zero, not a bug. So don't forget about it. In contrast, we have people like Lars Chernow and William Hayden Smith, who wrote a book called The Unpopular Truth. They get it. They understand that electricity is to modern civilization what blood is to the human body. If we don't have abundant, affordable, reliable electricity, we run into serious problems very quickly, okay? So that's what we should be using to run our electricity system. Instead, we're getting pauseful electricity from the academics in that, or adapt to weather conditions. That's what we're being told. So moving on to our next idea, this idea that we need to transition away from fossil fuels and nuclear because we need a just transition to green energy or clean energy. So then ask the question, is this stuff actually just? Is it actually clean? So you look at it, this is what the farmland's going to look like if we go to this idea of net zero, because Dan Scripps, who's the chair of the Michigan Public Service Commission, has testified before a state Senate Energy Committee that they're going to need, the state is going to need a minimum 209,000 acres of wind and solar, whether it's on farmland or state forest land or whatever. We're going to need that to achieve our net zero goals. Now, we've got, again, this paper that's coming out is going to show actually he's radically underestimated the amount of land that we need to do this, but they're still willing to admit we need over 200,000 acres covered with solar panels or wind turbines. So ask the question, is this stuff clean? Does this look clean? Large raptors, endangered species, golden eagles, bald eagles being sliced and diced by wind turbines. There was one company that's building wind turbines in the state of Michigan that just a few years ago was charged by the Department of Justice, this is the Biden Department of Justice of all things, and charged for killing 150 gold or bald eagles in their wind developments. So is that clean? We're killing off endangered species or threatened and endangered species. The next thing, there's a fellow named Vaclav Smil who is an emeritus prof at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The guy has written more books than a lot of people have read. So he's extremely prolific and he knows this sort of stuff. But in one of his papers, he asked the question, what do I see when I see a wind turbine? And he went through and he looked at all of the stages that are required to get a wind turbine, from mining the minerals, creating and building the blades and the towers and all that sort of stuff, transporting them, setting them up, and operating them. So he went through and he said, at every single one of these stages, you need fossil fuels to be able to get a wind turbine manufactured, transported, built, and operating. So Dave and I today, when we were driving past Ithaca, we looked over at one of the wind turbines that had just been put up in a farm field, and look, what do we see? Almost the same thing, running down the tower, lubricant oil, running down the tower, going into our farm fields. So that's the sort of thing. Vaclav Smil, when he looked at it, he said wind turbines are the pure embodiments of fossil fuels. When people tell you we're going to transition away from fossil fuels to wind and solar, they are either lying or they don't understand what it takes to get a wind turbine up and running. You do not have wind turbines or solar panels without fossil fuels. So we're not transitioning. The next part, you can ask, are solar and batteries good for the environment? They might be okay for our environment because we're not building them here. They're building them in China, and that's what it looks like when you build solar panels and battery, when you refine the rare earth minerals and the critical minerals that you need for that. So that's, if you Google, it's a place called Baotou, China. They've actually created a, you can see it from outer space, lake of toxic waste. Toxic and radioactive waste just kind of bubbling away on the ground. Used to be farm fields, not anymore, but we pat ourselves on the back saying that, look, we've got clean and green energy. Yeah, well, it's clean and green because we make the Chinese deal with the pollution. We're just offshoring our pollution and then telling ourselves we're clean and green. So more on the battery theme. There's a book called Cobalt Red by a guy named Siddharth Kara. He looked at what it takes to get the cobalt that we need for our batteries, whether it's for utility scale batteries or EVs or any of that kind of stuff. And he showed pictures like this. So I've worked in the mining industry and I've seen North American miners. I guarantee you there is not a North American mine in existence that allows people to stand barefoot in a toxic waste mud puddle, rinsing cobalt ore so that we can make batteries. I also guarantee you there's not a mine in North America that has 7- and 8-year-old kids working in it. They do have that, however, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So this sort of thing is not unusual. See the guy standing up almost to his hips in the puddle that they use to rinse the cobalt ore. There's no way on earth a North American worker would be allowed to do that. That mine would be shut down immediately. But because it's in a developing nation, it's not a problem. We'll do that and just, no, we're clean and green, right? Is this equitable or just? Ask those questions. What about slavery? Is slavery equitable and just? Because that's what's happening in China. And it's not me that's saying it. What's the name at the top of the screen? The New York Times is admitting it. They had studies done by the Biden Department of Justice and that said they're using forced labor, which is a much more pleasant way of saying slaves, to build EV batteries, solar panel components, polysilicon for solar, that sort of thing. So this is the Uyghur minority that you hear about in the Xinjiang region of China. People who are going to what the Chinese Communist government calls re-education facilities. So they're being re-educated to produce solar panels and solar components. But their education, like I went to high school, my high school didn't have like 12, 16-foot fences with razor wire at the top. Did not have armed guards patrolling outside saying, yeah, if you don't volunteer for this education process, then maybe somebody in your family is going to go missing tomorrow night. That's what's happening in this area. So that gives you, we answer that question. Is it clean and is it just? In both cases, the answer is no. So we'll move on to our next section. What's the cost of net zero? How are we going to do this in the state of Michigan? I will just tell you straight up and simple, there is no inexpensive way to achieve net zero. It's not possible. It's going to cost a lot of money, and depending on the choice that we make, could cost a lot of money or a little bit less, but still expensive, and it could impact the reliability of our grid even further. So we did modeling work with the guys at Always On Energy Research, and it basically built on other work that they've done. It's supposed to have been published in late June, but it's coming out in July. So what we did is we looked at two different scenarios. One was based on the energy legislation that was proposed in 2023. It did a first requirement or suggestion that we go to 100% wind, solar, and batteries. So we modeled that scenario. That one was replaced all our fossil fuels with wind, solar, and then we were allowed to maintain the existing nuclear capacity. The other one that we modeled was the lower cost decarbonization plan, and we used carbon capture for existing plants. And then while we're running out the full life cycle of plants like the Campbell plant and that, which close to here, the Monroe plant near Detroit, build new nuclear plants. Big APR 1400s, those are the large base load ones, and small modular reactors to use as what's called peaking power. On hot days you need more, so we'll just turn up the small modular reactors and make that work. It also included a little bit of battery storage. We did multiple scenarios for a couple reasons. It just improves decision making, basically, because you can have trade-offs, you can have more flexible options, and you reflect uncertainty. You can't always predict exactly what's going to happen on the ground. So that's why we did it. We looked at what does Michigan use right now. Effectively, Michigan uses mostly fossil for about 70% of our electricity, 20% nuclear, and about 10 to 12% renewables. So scenario one, there's a bunch of stuff there. This is the important thing right there. It's going to cost the state $386 billion, which means by the state, I mean all of you, to achieve these net zero goals if we went wind, solar, and battery, which was the first option. The other part of it is right here. Multiple capacity shortfalls. Remember what I already told you about the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. Remember what I told you about New Orleans. That's what capacity shortfall means, blackouts. So that was what we would transition to. The most efficient measure was basically, look, it's going to be all wind and solar with a little bit of nuclear. So how much is that going to cost? I already told you $386 billion. And this is the problem area. Red stuff in the graph is bad. You don't want that, because what it means is, look, our wind is not producing, our batteries can't hold up, and our solar isn't producing enough to actually meet the demand. And so what we modeled was several capacity shortfalls throughout the year. This is the worst of them, as much as 61 hours contiguous without electricity in January. So does that impact anybody's life in this state? January with no electricity for 61 hours. So our next version, as I already described, was basically put carbon capture on existing plants, coal and natural gas, run them until their full life cycle is finished, and then build nuclear. That one comes for the bargain price of $206 billion. So it's about half the cost. And most importantly, no capacity shortfalls. So David's looking at his watch, so I'm going to go through these slides quickly. Okay. Basically, what we get is mostly nuclear at the end of our process. We know nuclear works. It doesn't emit CO2, and it's completely reliable. So we know that that works. So the LCD scenario, the reason we said this is a better option is because it extends the operation of existing plants. We've already paid for them. We may as well use them for their full life cycle. Because what we're doing right now, to put it into English, shutting down plants early, is like buying a house, getting a 30-year mortgage on it, living in the house for 10 years, and then going, I don't want to be here anymore. Going out, buying a new house, getting another 30-year mortgage on it, driving a cat through that first house so you can't live in it anymore, you're tearing it down and destroying it, and then paying both mortgages. That's our plan right now, which has already been approved for the integrated resource plans for both DTE and Consumers Energy. We're going to close down our coal plants 15 years early for the Campbell plant and as much as 9 years early for the Monroe plant. Everybody in the room is going to keep paying for them because the utility is not going to cover that cost. You are. In the meantime, we're going to build new wind and solar and new transmission lines to provide unreliable and expensive energy, and you're going to pay for that too. So you're going to pay for both of them. The LCD plan costs, again, about half as much, and notice on this graph, no capacity shortfalls. There's no red areas in the graph because we can rely on either coal or natural gas or nuclear to achieve what we need for reliability. There's a lot of stuff on this graph. These two numbers are the important bit. The average increase to achieve that 386 billion or 206 billion, the average monthly increase over the study period is $2,700 a year for the average Michigan resident versus about $1,500 a year. So that's obviously the better option. Costs about half as much and no electricity shortages. And at the same time, it produces almost the exact same result. So the LCD problem or scenario still reduces CO2 emissions to essentially zero. We still achieve the same end goal, but we're using reliable and more affordable generation technologies. And then just as kind of, again, what's the punchline of this? Our net zero stuff doesn't even matter because if we achieve net zero for the state of Michigan, by the year 2100, we will have overall global climate change reductions in temperatures of 0.0015 degrees Celsius. That's Michigan's big, we're doing our part, right? So essentially what it means is that China and India are producing so much more CO2 that will reduce global temperatures by we'll make a difference of about 2.5 minutes in a year for the entire amount. 0.0015 degrees Celsius is what we achieve by spending either 206 billion or 386 billion to change our electricity system. So the conclusion, we should be balancing environmental goals with economic reality. We should, if we're gonna stick with the net zero option, we should choose to mitigate the damage that net zero is gonna cause. It's going to cause damage, it's gonna be expensive, but we should choose the one that still preserves the reliability of our grid and does it at about half the cost. So again, consider the economic costs, embrace technological innovation, things like the small modular reactors, and then prioritize energy security. So whatever we do, we should make sure that our elected officials are prioritizing energy policies that maintain or improve the adequacy and reliability of our electric grid. Do not pass legislation or policies that make our grid less reliable and more expensive. There's no point in that. And I'll leave you with one thought from a guy named Ken Braun who writes for the Capital Research Center. In an article he wrote this, which I thought was quite pithy. A dark children's hospital is way more problematic than a functional coal-fired power station. So I'm happy to answer questions or comments.
All right, if you have a question and we didn't get a card, you can write it and Adam will come around and pick it up. So we'll go through the questions over the next several minutes. First one, I have been told that for every coal-powered plant that we close, China is opening about 4 more at the same time. Is this correct?
Yeah, China is still en route to open. They're opening 1 or 2 every couple weeks, 1 or 2 new coal plants. So to give you kind of an idea of what's going on, in the United States, we have about 177 gigawatts of operating coal power plants. So what does that mean? The Palisades nuclear plant that was closed down a few years ago that they're trying to reopen, that plant is 0.8 gigawatts. To give you an idea of what that means. We have 177 gigawatts of operating coal in the United States. About half of that is targeted for closure over the next 5 to 7 years. China, on the other hand, has over 1,100 gigawatts, like a 10x factor. And then on top of that, they have in the queue to build new ones, they have over 250 gigawatts of new coal plants that are set to be built over the next 5 to 7 years. So we're going to close our coal plants while China opens even more, even though they already have 10x what we are operating. So are we going to have an impact? Again, go back to the slides I showed you. No, we're not going to have any impact. So.
Next question is going to deal with solar panels on productive farmland. How can solar companies outbid farmers by 5 to 10 times the land and rental rates? And how does their business model make this possible?
In a word, because of you. You're paying taxes. So the solar companies get what's called the production tax credit when they build and operate wind and solar plants. And federal government takes your tax dollars and gives them either, if they use what's called the investment tax credit, they get a 30% tax credit when they build the solar panels or wind turbines, 30% tax credit, or they get the production tax credit. Every time you see one of those wind turbines spinning around, they're reaching into your pocket and taking a penny or 2 pennies or a quarter or something like that. So a lot of people jokingly, when they're driving up and down the highway and they see wind turbines not moving, they go, they're not even producing anything. When I see that, I say, sweet, because they're not taking my money when they're not spinning.